My daughter-in-law said it plainly at the dinner table that I had become a burden in their lives. There are pains that don't come from strangers. They come from the very people you always believed would never hurt you. When that happens, do you react right away? Or do you choose silence to preserve what you still call family? I didn't react the way people expected, and that silence allowed many truths to reveal themselves. If you've ever stayed silent out of love, this story might be for you. Stay with me. I want to tell you. I have always believed that in life, everything happens according to its own order. We don't always see it right away, but if we remain calm enough, slow down enough, the truth will eventually find its way out. I have lived most of my life with that belief, not because I am especially wise, but because I have been reckless before, reacted while my emotions were still tangled, and paid the price for decisions made when my mind was not at peace. After my husband passed away, I learned how to live more slowly, not out of sadness, but because I understood that some losses cannot be filled with busyness or noise. I continued going to work regularly. My job was stable enough that I didn't have to worry about money, but I never talked much about it. I never felt the need to prove how much I had or how much I earned. I preferred a simple life, eating just enough, wearing comfortable clothes, and coming home early every evening. My life revolved around very ordinary things. A small apartment, a few potted plants on the balcony, quiet mornings brewing coffee and sitting still while reading the news. And one more important thing, my son, Evan. He is my only child. After his father died, we grew close in a quiet way. Not many words, but always there when it mattered. Every Sunday, I would drive to Evan's house for dinner. It was a habit formed when he was still single, and I kept it even after he got married. I didn't think much about whether it was right or wrong. I simply believed that sharing one meal a week was a good way to remind each other that we were still family. My daughter-in-law, Lydia, was polite. She always greeted me, always spoke just enough. But there was always a thin, indistinct distance between us, like a clear pane of glass. Not exactly cold, but not close either. I once thought this might be normal. Young people have their own world. I didn't want to step too deeply into a space where I hadn't been invited. So I kept my place very carefully. I came, had dinner, asked how they were, and then left. I didn't interfere, didn't offer opinions, didn't judge. I believed that if I held on to kindness and clarity, every relationship would eventually find its own way to function. At least that was what I believed at the time. When Evan told me that he and Lydia wanted to buy a house, I wasn't surprised. At that age, everyone wants a place to call their own, a place to begin family life, to feel truly grown up. I didn't ask many questions. I didn't offer advice. I simply listened. I helped my son buy that house, not with grand promises or binding agreements. I just did what I believed needed to be done. I didn't go into financial details. I felt he didn't need to know everything. Some things parents simply take care of quietly, without seeking credit. I believe that when love is sincere enough, it doesn't need to be repeated or explained. I continued living as before. My small apartment didn't change much. I didn't shop more, didn't change cars, didn't upgrade my lifestyle. I still cooked simple meals, cleaned for myself, and did my own laundry. I was comfortable with that rhythm. For me, enough was enough. I didn't need more to feel secure. Sunday dinners continued regularly. I arrived at my son's house on time, bringing a homemade dish or a small cake. Evan often came home late. When he arrived, his shoulders always seemed weighed down, as if carrying the entire day with him. He ate quickly, spoke in fragments, then excused himself to reply to emails or check unfinished work. Lydia was different. She was present from the beginning of the meal, but her mind always seemed elsewhere. Her phone sat right beside her plate. The screen lit up constantly. Sometimes she nodded along with the conversation. Sometimes she offered only a polite smile. I didn't blame her. I thought young people today lived faster and under more pressure than my generation did. I told myself these things many times, that Evan was trying his best, that Lydia had her own worries, that I shouldn't be overly sensitive. I chose silence. I believed silence was the best way to avoid interfering and not become an additional burden on my children. I didn't realize that silence, too, is a choice, and every choice leaves its mark. I continued giving in my own way. No probing questions, no difficult conversations, no demands for recognition. I believed that if I was patient enough, well-intentioned enough, everything would eventually balance itself out. I believed that family bonds didn't need calculations or clear boundaries. At least that was what I believed for a very long time, until I began to feel that a hollow space was slowly growing, right within the silence I had chosen. The initial changes were difficult to name. They didn't arrive as conflicts or harsh words. They appeared as passing complaints, sighs that seemed almost unintentional. A few times during meals, Lydia mentioned money. Not directly, but through half-finished remarks. The cost of living was rising. The house always needed repairs. That everything was more expensive than expected. She said these things in a tired voice, as if carrying a burden heavier than she could manage. "We're always having to calculate everything," she said once, her eyes still fixed on her phone. "Sometimes I feel like I don't even get a moment to breathe." I listened, nodded, and didn't ask further. I thought that young people today lived in a different cycle. There were pressures my generation no longer had to face. I didn't want to become one more item on the list of things that made them more exhausted. One afternoon, I stopped by their house earlier than usual to return a folder of papers Evan had left in my car. I stood on the porch, about to ring the doorbell, when I heard Lydia's voice from inside. She was on the phone, her irritation completely undisguised. "Mom, please stop asking," Lydia said. "We're already juggling everything we can. What does she even help with? She just comes over for dinner and leaves. I'm so tired." I stood still. My hand remained on the doorbell, but I didn't press it. I wasn't angry, at least, not in the way people usually define anger. But something tightened quickly, sharply, like when someone accidentally touches a bruise that hasn't had time to heal. I returned to my car without letting them know I had been there. On the drive home, I reminded myself that maybe Lydia was just venting, that everyone sometimes says things that don't truly reflect their deepest thoughts. I told myself that perhaps I hadn't heard the whole story, that I shouldn't rush to conclusions while my heart was still unsettled. I believed that if I stayed calm, the unclear things would eventually reveal themselves. I didn't know then that I had already begun stepping into a different phase of the story. I only knew that from that day on, Sunday dinners no longer felt as light as before, even though, on the surface, everything still looked perfectly normal. That Sunday dinner began like any other, but I sensed something was different the moment I walked into the house. The air felt heavier, as if something had already been prepared, simply waiting for the right moment to be spoken. Evan was home early, which rarely happened. He sat silently at the dining table, eyes lowered, hands resting in front of him without touching his glass of water. Lydia moved back and forth in the kitchen, talking more than usual, yet her voice was tense, unnatural. We sat down to eat. I had just picked up my chopsticks when Lydia put hers down first, let out a long breath, and turned toward me. "Helen," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I think it's time we spoke frankly with each other." I nodded. "Go ahead." Lydia glanced briefly at Evan, then turned back to me. "I think that maybe you should have more of your own space. I mean, you're getting older. Living alone isn't always the best option. There are places, with care, with activities, safer." I understood immediately what she meant, but I didn't react right away. I set my chopsticks down and looked at her, my voice even. "You mean a nursing home?" Lydia hesitated slightly, then nodded. "Not exactly a nursing home, just a place more suitable for you, and besides, we're trying to build our own life. A family needs its own space." I turned to Evan. "What do you think?" Evan didn't look up. He stayed silent. The silence lasted longer than I expected, long enough that I could clearly hear the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Lydia continued, her voice beginning to rise. "You don't understand. We're under so much pressure already. Every week we have to plan dinner, arrange our time. Sometimes I feel like I'm taking on an extra responsibility that no one ever asked me if I wanted." I remained seated. I didn't realize I had become such a burden. There was no sarcasm in my words. It was simply the truth spoken after a long pause. Something in Lydia snapped. She stood up abruptly. "Can't you see it? You're always around, always needing attention. We can't keep revolving around you forever." Then she said things that I knew, no matter how many apologies might come later, could never be fully taken back. Evan still said nothing. I stood up. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I looked at my son one last time, waiting for something, a sentence, a sign, but nothing came. "I understand," I said, my voice softer than usual. "I won't be a disturbance anymore." I took my coat and walked out. When the door closed behind me, I knew I had just left a house. But what was truly left behind was the belief that silence always meant love. I wasn't angry, but something had broken, and this time, I knew it would never return to the way it was. I drove home in silence. The familiar road suddenly felt longer than usual, not because of traffic, but because I no longer felt the need to turn on music or call someone to fill the emptiness. I just wanted to go home. That was all. When the apartment door closed behind me, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I hung up my coat, washed my hands, and then sat down at the kitchen table. My small kitchen was so quiet that I could clearly hear the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. I sat there for a long time, doing nothing. I didn't cry, at least not yet. My body was strangely calm, as if it were holding me in place, keeping me from being swept away by emotion too quickly. I brewed a cup of tea, then left it there, untouched. In that silence, a question appeared with perfect clarity, without my having to search for it. Was I hurt by what Lydia said? Or by Evan's silence? I closed my eyes and didn't avoid the question. I knew the answer immediately. Words, no matter how heavy, exist only in the moment. But my son's silence was different. It wasn't a sentence. It was a choice. I began to look back at myself, not to blame, but to understand. I realized that for many years I had been giving without speaking. I thought that was love. I believed that if I didn't mention it, didn't set conditions, everything would remain purer. But I also had to admit something uncomfortable. By staying silent for too long, I had unintentionally taught others that my giving was a given, that I would always be there, no matter how I was treated. I sat there and let that thought settle. I made no decisions that night. I didn't call Evan, I didn't text Lydia, I didn't write a to-do list. I made only one decision, to do nothing yet. I understood that if I acted right then, I wouldn't be acting from clarity. I would be reacting to pain, and I didn't want to make any decision while my heart was still trembling like that. I believed that if I paused long enough, if my heart truly became calm, the right direction would reveal itself. I turned off the kitchen light, went into the bedroom, and for the first time in many years, I allowed myself to sleep without having to resolve everything immediately. I didn't rush to do anything in the days that followed. I still went to work, still cooked my meals, still kept my familiar routine. But inside me, there was an obvious need, not to retaliate, but to understand. One afternoon, I took out an old folder that I hadn't touched in a long time, documents related to Evan's house. I opened each page slowly, not with the intention of finding fault with anyone, but simply to look back at what I had done. Everything was still in my name. I sat there for a long while after realizing that. There was no sense of victory, no relief either, just a very straightforward clarity. I had helped my son, but I had never truly let go of ownership, not because I wanted control, but because I believed I was simply keeping a safeguard against the uncertainties of life. I called my lawyer, not to ask how to take anything back, but to ask a straightforward question. Where did I stand, and what were my boundaries? We met in a small office without any tension. I told him everything from beginning to end, without adding or omitting anything. He listened, then spoke very slowly, very clearly. Legally, the house belonged to me. I had the right to decide everything related to it. I nodded. I didn't feel empowered. I only felt reminded of something I had forgotten for far too long. Boundaries are not meant to punish anyone. Boundaries exist to protect both sides. As we clarified the paperwork, another detail gradually came to light. Lydia was not nearly as financially strained as she had claimed. The numbers, the financial information, without even digging deeply, were enough to show that the story of exhaustion and hardship was not entirely true. I didn't feel pleased upon realizing this. I didn't feel angry either. I only felt sad. Sad because when people are unwilling to face their own insecurity, they often build stories to protect themselves, and in doing so, they can hurt others without realizing it. I left the lawyer's office with a very different feeling, not the feeling of preparing for a confrontation, but the feeling of standing more firmly within myself. I knew what rights I had, but more importantly, I began to understand that real power does not lie in what one can do to others. It lies in what one chooses to do with oneself. And I knew that from that moment on, I could no longer continue living in the same ambiguity as before. I didn't call ahead. I simply sent Evan a short message saying I needed to talk and asking when both of them would be free. We agreed on a weekday evening at that very house. I arrived on time, neither early nor late. Lydia opened the door. There was a hint of caution on her face, but she maintained her politeness. Evan stood behind her, looking more worn than I remembered. We sat down at the dining table. No one spoke for the first few minutes. I was the one who spoke first. "I want to make one thing clear," I said, my voice neither raised nor lowered. "Legally, this house is still in my name." The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Lydia froze, then let out a short laugh, as if I had just said something impossible to take seriously. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "We're living here, paying for it, building our lives here." "I know," I replied, "and I've never denied that, but ownership is a different matter." Evan turned to look at me, his eyes wide. "Mom, are you serious?" "I don't say things unless I'm certain," I answered. "I didn't come here to argue. I just want everything to be placed where it belongs." Lydia stood up abruptly. "Then why are you holding on to this house? To remind us that we owe you?" "No," I said immediately. "I've never needed you to owe me anything." That answer made Lydia hesitate. She stood there, her hands clenched, her voice beginning to tremble. "You don't understand how much pressure we're under. We're always afraid it won't be enough, afraid of doing something wrong, afraid of losing everything." The words that followed were no longer as sharp as before. They broke apart into scattered fragments of exhaustion and anxiety. Lydia spoke about her work, about the constant need to prove that she was worthy, about the fear of being left behind. For the first time, I didn't see her as an opponent, but as someone trying to keep her balance on unsteady ground. I waited until she finished before speaking. "I don't need to win," I said. "I need respect, that's all." Lydia sat back down, covering her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook, not with anger, but with fatigue. Evan finally spoke then, his voice hoarse. "I was weak," he said. "I didn't know how to speak up. I was afraid of making things worse, so I stayed silent." I looked at my son, and for the first time in a very long while, I saw that he was no longer pretending to be fine, just someone standing in front of choices he had never learned how to face. No one won in that room, but something had changed. The truth had been placed on the table, not to hurt, but so that everyone could see one another more clearly, even if doing so was deeply uncomfortable. Truth does not arrive in loud moments. It comes slowly and often begins with a tiny detail. Evan was the one who spoke first, not in a confident voice, but in the voice of someone who had held something inside for far too long. He lowered his head, his hands clasped together. "I've been paying," he said, "ever since we moved in." Lydia turned to look at Evan, as if unsure of what she had just heard. "What did you say?" "I didn't tell Mom," Evan continued, his voice steady but hoarse. "And I didn't tell Lydia either. I thought it was something I had to do." He told us slowly about the monthly transfers, about the weekend side jobs, about trying to carry everything himself so he wouldn't feel like he was accepting something too big to ever repay. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. I didn't raise my voice. I only needed to understand. "Because I was afraid," Evan answered. "Afraid you'd think I was weak. Afraid Lydia would think I wasn't capable. I thought silence was the best option." Lydia sat still for a long time. Her expression shifted little by little, as if a familiar story in her mind was being dismantled. She looked at Evan, then at me. "So, all this time I was wrong," Lydia said quietly. "I thought I was carrying everything. I thought I'd been left alone." I looked at them, and in that moment, I didn't see an irresponsible son or a cruel daughter-in-law. I saw two young people who had let fear guide them for too long. One chose silence to prove himself. The other chose defense by pushing someone else away. I understood something important. Evan wasn't indifferent. He simply lacked the courage to speak the truth. And that lack of courage had created space for misunderstandings to grow larger and larger. "I hear you," I said, "and I acknowledge what you've done." I paused for a moment so they wouldn't misunderstand what I was about to say. "But understanding doesn't mean everything is erased," I continued. "Forgiveness doesn't eliminate consequences. It only opens the chance to do things differently." The room fell silent. No one objected. No one pleaded. For the first time, we weren't trying to win against one another. We were simply learning to look directly at what had happened and to accept that maturity always comes with taking responsibility, even for things we never intended to cause. After that conversation, I didn't make a decision right away. I needed more quiet, not to hesitate, but to be certain that what I did came from clarity, not from lingering emotion. A few days later, I asked Evan and Lydia to meet again. This time, there was no longer the same tension as before, perhaps because everything that needed to be said had already been said. I went straight to the point. "I want you to move out of this house," I said. "Not immediately, but within a reasonable period of time. You need to start over somewhere else." Lydia lowered her head. Evan clenched his hands, but didn't object. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I continued. "I'm doing it because this house has become a place that holds too many misunderstandings. If you stay here, you won't truly move beyond what has happened." I paused, then explained more clearly. "I will support you, but with conditions." Both of them looked up at me. "First," I said, "is respect. Not just in words, but in how you treat me and how you treat each other. Second is responsibility. Each person must carry their own part without placing it on someone else. And third is maturity. That means having the courage to speak honestly, to face things directly, and to make changes." No one interrupted me. "There's something else I need to say," I continued, my voice slowing. "I'm not standing here as someone who is completely right. I was wrong to stay silent for too long. I thought I was protecting you. But I avoided the conversations that needed to happen. I accept that part of my responsibility." The atmosphere in the room settled. There was no more arguing about right and wrong. Only the truth remained between the three of us, undecorated, unsoftened, but not distorted either. "I'm not taking back the house to prove anything," I said. "I'm simply restoring the boundaries that I should have set from the beginning." Evan nodded. Lydia exhaled as if for the first time she no longer had to brace herself. There were no tears, no pleading, only a slow, genuine acceptance. And I knew that even if the road ahead wouldn't be easy, it was at least being built on a foundation of clarity. After everything was put back in its proper place, my life naturally slowed down, not because I forced a change, but because I was no longer being pulled by things I couldn't control. I still went to work, but I no longer let work fill every empty space. I began to make time for quieter mornings, unhurried lunches, and conversations with no purpose other than presence. I reconnected with a few old friends, people who had been there during very different chapters of my life. We didn't talk much about the past. We talked about the present, about minor things, about what we were learning to let go of. I realized that when I stopped trying to hold everything together, life naturally made room for more genuine connections. The relationship between Evan and me changed as well. There were no longer obligation-driven dinners, no more meetings born from fear of hurting each other. We met when we were both ready, we spoke more directly, and we were also more comfortable sharing silence. I no longer felt the need to sacrifice myself to keep my son close. Evan no longer felt the need to prove anything to me. Lydia changed slowly, not because anyone demanded it, but because she began to see her own share of responsibility in what had happened. She learned to speak about her fears instead of pushing them onto others. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments of uncertainty, but I saw in her a new honesty, one that no longer hid behind so many defenses. I don't call it complete forgiveness. I call it acceptance. Acceptance that everyone has chapters in life they didn't handle well. What matters is whether we stop to look or keep going without ever turning back. Now, when I look back, I don't see myself as having won against anyone. I only see that I didn't allow my heart to lose to itself. When I stopped trying to control, to explain, to please everyone, things naturally found their proper place. I believe that when the heart is truly calm, the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to be placed where it belongs, and the rest life will take care of on its own.